right, we know how to find data in the database using find and find one. Now I want to show you how to project certain fields out of the documents you get from the database. Now projection is very similar to the way you use select in a relational database, in that it lets you specify which fields you want back. Let's say you have a document with an underscore ID of 1 and a key of A with a value of 2 and a key of B with a value of 3 and a key of C with a value of 4. And you want to find that document in the database, but you only want to see the value for A and the value for C. You can do that using a projection. And the way you do it is when you call find, the first parameter in find is the filter, the actual query itself, to figure out which documents you want to return. The second parameter is going to be a document that specifies which fields you want to return. This is the projection. So let me show you concretely how that works by showing you a small program. Now here's a small program that's going to go into the same database and the same collection we've been using, which is the school database and the scores collection. And we're going to call find. We have a function called find. And that function is going to set up a query with type exam, and you'll see that's just a Python dictionary, and type is again a string literal and exam is a string literal, and they're both quoted. And so I'm saying I want to find the documents where type is exam, and then I don't want to get all the fields from the document. Instead, I only want to get the student ID, and I want to suppress the underscore ID. So when you give a field and then you have a 1 here, that means include it. When you have a 0, it means exclude it. Now, normally for a projection, if you don't include a field, it won't be included. But underscore ID is special, and unless you suppress it by giving a 0 value, you will see it. So then we run the query right here. We call scores.find. Here's the query, and here's the projection that we laid out. And if there's an exception, we handle that here. Otherwise, we print out the contents that we find inside the collection. And again, we just print out the first 10. And this is just us calling the find function. So let's call that and see what it looks like. So I'm going to invoke the Python interpreter, invoking the Python interpreter using the program we just wrote, which is called using find with projection. And if we do that, we see that we get the documents with student ID and nothing else. And if we went back in here and we didn't suppress the underscore ID, even though we didn't include it, we're going to see it. So now we run this again, and now we get all the underscore IDs for each document. And that's the way projections work. Now, if you wanted to figure this out yourself, you could look in the documentation. And one thing I want to really emphasize in this class is that the documentation is a great source of information on both Pymongo itself and MongoDB. So I'm going to do that real fast so you can see how that looks. So I would probably start at api.mongodb.org again, and I'd click on Python. And we're running the beta driver, the 3.0 beta 0 driver, so I'm going to click on that. For you, the 3.0 driver may be released by the time you watch this. I'm going to wind up in this documentation. This documentation has a lot of information. The part that's most interesting is the API documentation. And the API documentation is laid out with all the different classes inside. But most of the things that we're interested in are actually methods in the collection class, because we're calling find and find one, and these are all on the collection class. So I'm going to go in there and look at that, and then I'm just going to search inside it for find. And I get a few instances. Oh, and there it was. So here's the actual find command. And you can see the find command takes a filter. That was what we called the query. And then it takes a projection. And it tells you all the parameters that you can put in here. Now projection, you'll see here it's shown as a named parameter. So you could have done it as a name parameter versus a positional parameter. I could have said projection equals, but I didn't. And you can see, if you look under find one, you'll see that it tells you that the arguments themselves are the same as from find. They say here the keyword arguments come from find, so you could just go there if you want to see those arguments, which is where we just were. Now this is very useful if you're trying to figure out what something does inside Pymongo, is to go into the documentation and look at the API documentation to see it and find out what the parameters are. And there's a lot of parameters that we haven't even talked about yet that you could explore yourself, or we'll get to a lot of them in the class. All right, now it's time for a quiz. Let's talk about projecting results from find. Which of the following, these are Python statements, which of the following could work using Pymongo, depending on variable names, to project just a student ID from the scores collection? All right, just a student ID from the scores collection using a find command. So which of the following of these is the correct syntax to do that?